Hello, and welcome to the 2019 City of Riverside City Council debates. My name is Patricia Locke Dawson, and I am the president of the Raincross Group. The Raincross Group is a group of passionate and involved citizens who work hard to make and keep Riverside an amazing place to live. We need to elect leaders who will be good stewards of our city. This year, we have 4 seats on the City Council that are up for election. These are the seats that represent wards 1, 3, 5, and 7. And so the Raincross Group is proud to co-sponsor the 2019 City Council debates, along with our partners, the PIC Group, Riverside Community College District, the Press Enterprise, and Charter Communications. We hope that these debates will help you make an informed decision. Our moderator for the debate will be Brad Pomerantz, television host and producer of KVCR's Uncovered in the Archives. A recording will be available through the Raincross Group website. And remember, this June's election is through a mail-in ballot only, so please don't forget to vote before June 4th, and stay engaged. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy the debates.
Welcome to the 2019 Riverside City Council debates. My name is Brad Pomerantz. I'll be your moderator today. I currently host Uncovered in the Archives on KVCR PBS for Greater Inland California. These debates are brought to you by the PIC Group, the Raincross Group, Riverside City College, Spectrum, and the Riverside Press Enterprise, who will be streaming these debates on their website. This is an all-mail-in election. The ballots will be issued on May 6th. The ballots will be counted on June 4th. It's my honor to introduce you to the 3 candidates running for the Riverside City Council in Ward 1. They are Erin Edwards. She is a nonprofit manager. Philip Falcone. He is a nonprofit professional. And Mike Gardner. He is the incumbent in Ward 1. During this debate, which will last approximately 1 hour, I will be asking a series of questions. The candidates will have an opportunity to respond, 90 seconds maximum. In my discretion, I may ask for the candidates to engage in conversation with me to further illuminate and elucidate any answers that they have given. There will not be opening or closing statements. Rather, I will ask questions in opening and closing that will elicit such similar information. We will start our first question with Erin. We will go 1, 2, 3, then 2, 3, 1, then 3, 1, 2. Okay, so I would like to start with Erin Edwards. Briefly introduce yourself, and in 2 or 3 sentences, explain why you want to serve on the Riverside City Council over the next 4 years.
Good morning. My name is Erin Edwards, and my background is in the nonprofit sector, addressing issues like homelessness for over a decade, leading a network of soup kitchens, food pantries, homeless shelters, and managing a $7 million portfolio of health investments for a United Way. And I would like to serve on Riverside City Council and believe I'm well suited for it because homelessness is one of the biggest issues that we're facing as a city, as a region, as a state. And as I mentioned, that is my background, addressing complex issues like this. So I have very specific skills that I can lend to the city at this time to help us address this issue, get ahead of an even bigger problem down the road, find funding to address it not only within our city, but to address it regionally and across the state.
Philip Falcone.
Thank you, Brad. My name is Philip Falcone. I have a very personal story that when it comes to what has brought me to this point in time, what has encouraged me to run for city council. My family moved to Riverside 14 years ago from New Orleans, Louisiana, following Hurricane Katrina. We had lost everything in the hurricane and came to Riverside with 5 days worth of clothing in our suitcases. But the people of Riverside, this community, in their great generosity and sense of charity, have given so much to my family at that point in time, that great need. Gave so much to my family, assisted with getting us back on our feet, offering new opportunities that have really opened so many doors. I'm a product of this community, attended Riverside schools, served as a city commissioner, worked in the mayor's office, really experienced firsthand how our city operates. And we are faced in Riverside with significant challenges as well as opportunities as we progress and move forward over the course of the next several decades. I'm focused on bringing a unique generational view to the City Council that is focused on the long run, ending cycles of short-sightedness and focusing on how do we address some of our most critical problems and challenges with the big picture in mind.
Mike Gardner.
Thank you. I came to Riverside New Year's Day 1971 to continue my education at UCR. While I was at UCR, I met and married my wife. We started a family. During my graduate schooling, I went to work for Southern California Edison Company, and I was training to be an archaeologist. I was hired by Edison as an archaeologist, the first hired by an electric utility anywhere in the country. I worked for Edison in a variety of positions for 23 years. One of the ones I think is most applicable for the consul position is I managed one of Edison's customer service districts. I managed directly about 250 people in a $33 million budget. I have worked in the nonprofit and for-profit sector, the public sector, the private sector. I'm the only one of the candidates who has done that. I've been your council member now for almost 12 years. I think I've done a good job of it. I have the knowledge and experience to continue to lead our city through the challenging times that we have coming in the next few years. We have some significant financial issues to get through. We need to deal with homelessness. We need to deal with our housing programs, and I believe I'm the best person, or best qualified person to do that.
Thank you. I want to jump to the question of homelessness. Two of the three candidates just brought it up. And so I'd like to ask, as we know, Riverside has reached out to churches, community groups, and even created the new Office of Homeless Solutions. Should the city offer more shelter services, or would more support encourage more homelessness? How should the city approach this challenge? We know we recently had a point-in-time count. The prior count in 2017 indicated we had about 400 homeless, which is 400 too many, but that is down from prior years. We know that. So I'd like to start with Philip Falcone, please.
Homelessness is a very complex topic, and there's not going to be one best way of addressing it. We have to look at a multi-pronged approach. I've very publicly said time and time again that I believe if we strictly and too heavy-handedly focus on the shelter and emergency options, that those are band-aid solutions to a long-term problem. Completely, yes, we need that, and we should be having those services available for those that need that. However, though, we have to really be focused on the long-term approach, and I think that is where we focus on getting to the underlying causes that are causing homelessness. Some of it being mental illness, substance abuse, a lack of affordable housing, job insecurity. Those are some of the things that I'm prepared to be more focused on instead of some of the more band-aid solutions which are in the short term. We need both, but we have to have a balance, and I'm focused more so on the long term, addressing those concerns.
Mike Gardner.
Homelessness is probably the most visible issue facing our city, and the one that is most troubling to our residents, both those with homes and those without. We need to have additional shelter services. We have currently about 65 beds in the general shelter, 50 beds in our family shelter. In cold weather, we add another 65 beds. The council has approved a program to double the beds in the general shelter. We have just recently added 28 mental health-oriented beds for the first time, focusing on that area. We have adopted a Housing First program where people who are on the streets are offered housing, their own room, And people do much better in dealing with their issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, job counseling, if they're not worried about where they're going to live and where their food is going to come from. We've housed 117 people between February of last year and February of this year. Moved 117 people off the streets into permanent housing. We are currently working with just over 350 people who are interested in those services, and we are working to provide them.
Aaron Edwards.
Homelessness has many faces in Riverside. It's the UCR student who's living in her car and is too ashamed to tell anyone about it. It's the woman who lives in the parking lot of the old Kmart because her husband passed away and she could no longer afford to live in her house. Just as there are many faces of people experiencing homelessness, there are many different solutions and approaches to this issue. We do need to be, as a city, thinking about how to approach it in the short, the medium, and the long term. In the short term, and I think we need to work on all three of these at the same time. In the short term, we simply do not have enough shelter beds for the number of people who need shelter every single night. So we need to address that issue. Additionally, we need good policy in our city. And we are very lucky in Riverside because we have gold standard policy, housing first. Now we need a council member who will really lean in to that policy, make sure that it's enacted well across all 7 wards. And finally, in the long term, we need to think about how to prevent homelessness, because if we don't talk about how to make housing more affordable, how to make sure that people in their neighborhoods have access to food, to grocery stores, if we don't think about funding for mental health, we'll be looking at double or triple the number of people experiencing homelessness in our city in a very short time.
Aaron, you've worked in homelessness,
Yes.
so I wanted to ask you about a subset of the population. Those are the service resistant. I'm sure you know that there's a group, maybe a third of all homeless, who are simply not interested in obtaining services. What do you believe you can bring to the city council on that very question? Because it is a challenging one.
It is a challenging one, and there are some people who truly prefer to live off the grid. But what I think is the bigger issue is an issue of trust. So we know that it takes about 75 interactions with someone to get to a level of trust. And going back to this woman who's living in the Kmart parking lot, she knows every other person living in that parking lot with her and said to me, oh, a new young man showed up the other day. He didn't know how cold it gets at night, so I made sure to give him some blankets. So what I think we don't talk about enough is the communities that people establish when they're living on the streets and how we can be more creative as a city to address entire communities of people experiencing homelessness. Because of course, if you come to someone and say, do you want to go to a shelter, but you don't know what it will look like for you in the shelter, if you'll be safe there, who will be sleeping next to you, then you might say, no thank you, I don't prefer any help. It doesn't mean you don't want help. It means you need more time to get to trust and maybe would prefer to receive services with people you already know.
Mr. Gardner, you mentioned that in 1 year, 117 people were housed. Admirable, but as we know from the point in time count, we have about 400 in Riverside. And so what would you like to do, presuming you continue in this position, to provide needs for the other, 280?
Actually, it's close to 350 that we still need to house. The council has approved the Housing First program with a specific goal of developing 400 housing units that are available for people in that program. People who are in that program will have not just a room, but on-site. They will get the services that they require, tailored to their particular needs. So if a person needs mental health services, they get them. If they don't need mental health services, those aren't pushed on them. If they need substance abuse counseling, they get that. If they don't have that issue, they don't have that pushed on them. It's expensive. It is something that is difficult to cite because residential neighborhoods tend to be afraid of them, but it is important they be in residential neighborhoods or near residential neighborhoods because we all have to work together and live together.
Philip, arguably, you have experienced homelessness. You're a refugee of Hurricane Katrina. I don't know your specific circumstances, but one could argue you've been the closest. to homelessness. What does that experience bring to you as you look at this question, having been really a refugee of a massive crisis that led to arguable homelessness for your family?
Well, and I want to start with saying my family was very fortunate that we had a relative to fall back on here in Riverside, and that's ultimately what brought us to Riverside. So my family was fortunate in that regard. Many families aren't, though. And I think it does, as you're saying, Brad, that bring that unique viewpoint to the table that no other candidate can speak of. Of course, we can talk about anecdotal evidence, but it's different when you have experienced really coming to that cusp of what exactly the tragedy that could occur. And I think it brings that uniqueness because it shows that the individuals that are experiencing homeless it's a very diverse population. The causes are very diverse, and it's not just one specific issue or another. I think it brings a very valuable life experience of experiencing that to the decision-making table that will be valued on the City Council.
I want to shift to another issue, and that is the question of pensions. We're going to start with Mr. Gardner as I ask the following question. We know that the city has $563 million of unfunded mandates, a tsunami of higher pension costs in the next several years. How specifically would you, as a councilor, look to pay for these rising pension costs? And what services would you advocate trimming or cutting outright, if necessary, to cover increased spending on retirees? And please, for our candidates, be as specific as possible.
I don't believe that we have to cut any services to accomplish this. We have sufficient reserves to carry us through the next 2 years if we need to. That will draw our general fund reserve lower than we would like it to be, but that would assume we do nothing in the interim, and we are doing a lot in the interim. We have moved almost all employees from the city paying the employee share of their pension costs to the employee paying their share. In the next year, our public safety employees will get to full payment of their share. So that makes a difference. I think the real key is smart economic development. If we encourage the right kinds of development in our city, development that increases property tax, that increases wages and benefits and causes people to have more money to spend, that will drive sales tax up. We can fill that gap with revenue generated from existing taxes and fees, at least half of it. And it's important to remember that it's a 20-year problem. It's not a this year problem, it's not a next year problem. We've got 20 years to deal with that $500+ million number, and it's incremental year by year.
But what will happen after burning through the 2 years of reserves that we have? And we'll get to Aaron and Philip, of course.
We need to increase revenues or cut services. I am not in favor of cutting services. I don't think that is the right thing for us to do, and I don't think we need to do it. If we handle economic development correctly, and we also have an opportunity to divest the city of some resources that it holds that have a capital value, if it's undeveloped land, or even if it's developed land, if it goes into private hands, now it's paying property tax. It doesn't currently.
Sales tax? Is that
sales tax as well, depending on what happens with it. A house doesn't generate sales tax in and of itself. A business probably does.
Aaron, please.
The pension liability is certainly an enormous issue facing our city, one that needs to be addressed thoughtfully and well, but not an issue that we need to be afraid of. So when I think about the options that I've seen to address this issue, what rings true to me is that it will take a menu of options, not just one solution, to address our unfunded accrued liability. What sticks out to me in this menu is thinking of how we can pay our most expensive tranches of debt first, how we can look at city subsidies and city-owned land and make decisions about how to move forward, how we can think about, for example, I know going in front of the Budget Engagement Commission, they'll be talking about how to put funding into a trust that might help us pay down our debt a bit more on our own terms. But while we're talking about addressing the pension, we need to remember that meanwhile we have a city to run, and as you mentioned, many services that people in our city rely on. So I'd like to look at, across the city, different ways of budgeting. For example, moving from incremental budgeting to priority-based budgeting, where we line up what our priorities are, or we decide what our priorities are as a city, line up what's in our budget behind those priorities. And then also we need to increase revenue. So looking at how to have a grant writing department in our city so that each individual department isn't responsible for seeking funding some of these major grants. We simply can't afford to leave money on the table.
At the same time, though, Aaron, we know that our friends in San Bernardino and Detroit and Birmingham, I mean, their unfunded liabilities put them into bankruptcy. I wouldn't suggest that Riverside is close to that, but look, the next economic downturn could cause havoc. And so I'd just like you to expand on how you think we address that question, considering that downturns are inevitable.
If there is a downturn, and I know that we need to be as prudent as possible when they're budgeting, then we will do what we're doing now, which is look to the experts in our city who are at every opportunity analyzing this issue and coming up with, within what is legally possible, different ways that we can innovate within the box to address the pension liability.
Philip.
Funding the accrued pension liability, first and foremost, is a contract to our employees, our city employees. And I think it's very important to make it very well known that on the city council, I think it is absolutely necessary to maintain those contracts and to ensure the employees that have went into contract with the city in good faith that they know that their end of the bargain will be upheld on both sides in that regard. It will absolutely take long-term, prudent fiscal planning. I think that we definitely can look at the decades-long problem that this is. You know, by no means do I dismiss it as not as severe as it is. It is truly a severe problem, and we have to be looking at the long-term, prudent decisions in that regard. But we can do it, I believe, in a way that both balances the various needs for service that we have today without having those cuts, but also maintaining the contracts and the obligations in which we have. And I think absolutely diversifying the revenue streams is important, especially when you have in Ward 1, for instance, one of the wards that is facing the most development, you know, a boom, exponential development in our downtown and other places. And it's going to take very innovative and bold new leadership to continue moving that forward, continue the attraction of those businesses and developments that can help with that diversification of our revenue streams.
I want to follow up briefly. A couple of the candidates mentioned city-owned lands and the potential for selling off those lands to bring in revenue. We know a lot of those lands are actually owned by public utilities, and it's questionable at best as to whether that money could be transferred into the city. So I want to get a sense from you whether that is a solution that should be considered most strongly. Maybe look at regulations that would allow an easier transfer. What's your sense on that? Why don't we start brief answers from Mike, and then we'll go back to Aaron and Philip.
That's a really good question. The utilities do own a significant portion of land, and particularly our water utility. The water utility is subject to Proposition 218, which has significant control on how any revenue generated by the utility is used, and it must stay within the utility. That said, the utilities have a pension liability as well. Their employees are part of that $500+ million. So that's an opportunity to pay those funds. It's also an opportunity to, if not reduce, at least stabilize our utility rates over time, which can help with economic development. The less expensive our utilities are, the more people want to come here.
Aaron.
I did talk about in the menu of options the possibility of looking at the land that the city owns. I do think that is something that we need to explore, that I will explore on city council. Not something to be taken lightly, and particularly when it comes to the relationship with public utility and the land that they own. So this is a place where I would rely on city staff and the boards and commissions to really explore the options that we have here. And what's most important to me is that any of these conversations that happen with the utmost transparency, because I think that's where we've struggled in the past, is the concern that we're doing something that isn't above board. And so I would make sure that any of those conversations that are happening transparently.
Philip.
I think that it is definitely an option when we look at city-owned property. Of course, a vast majority is owned by the public utility, but we do have, though, across the city, various portions of land and other city assets that could benefit the larger general fund that we could be receiving some revenue into. So I think that is important to look at, but I oftentimes talk about the importance of this being very responsible and very meticulous. And the reason I say that is because rightfully so, and I would consider myself one of the community members that perhaps perhaps if you hear a candidate or city council being in favor of selling off of city assets, you want to be very cautious of exactly to whom is it being sold to and what exactly would be going on that parcel of land, in particular in various neighborhoods like our north side and as well as the downtown. So I think when we go into the potential of selling city-owned assets, we have to be very strategic in that ensuring the sale of those and the projects that may come to those specific portions of land are responsible and make sense for the neighborhood in which they're being placed. And that, I think, is a critical component.
It's hard to deny that Riverside is a crown jewel in inland California, a beautiful city. One of the reasons one could argue is because of the Renaissance that occurred in the middle of a downturn because of the leadership of forefathers in the early part of this century. We are the city of arts and innovation, and so I want to speak about that. What does this moniker mean to you, the city of arts and innovation? What would you do to help the city better live up to that? Would you consider some type of revenue enhancement, maybe specifically applied to developers to expand public art? We're going to start back with Aaron.
I love that Riverside is called the City of Arts and Innovation. And in my work, my paid work for a Global Women's Fund, we talk a lot about innovation around the world, particularly within the nonprofit sector. And so I like thinking about how, as a city, we can be more innovative. Yes, I think it comes from having more public art, thinking about how to transform our alleyways, for example, as we've started to do with Mariposa Alley. But I also think it's about developing the muscle of innovation in Riverside. If we truly want to be a city of innovation, we need to do, and I look to South Bend, Indiana, for example. They call themselves the Beta City. And I love that because it's so hard to say to somebody, you innovate. But you can say to someone, you try, if you have an idea. And so I'd love to see us develop the muscle of trial and error and be a city where there's room for people to try ideas, to tap into the brain power of our 55,000 plus college and university students, to try ideas, if they don't work, to try again, to learn from mistakes. That's how we innovate. That's how we'll innovate here.
But could you be, I want to specifically ask you about the discussion surrounding an art tax that would be applied to developers. Would you support something along those lines, specifically for public art, which some would argue is a bit lacking in our beautiful city?
That is something that we could discuss. I know we need to be thoughtful as we think about the different mandates that we put on developers in our city. For me, it's even more important perhaps to have the conversation about how to make developments, particularly housing, more affordable. But what I know about innovation is that it often comes from the margins, it comes from people in communities. I'm not sure we need to think about an innovation tax, but do a better job of talking to the people who live here to hear their ideas, to hear how we can innovate some of these problems that we're seeing at the grassroots level.
Philip.
You had mentioned that we are the crown jewel of inland Southern California, and I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. And I think with a slogan like the City of Arts and Innovation, that really poises us to be in a place to really launch and continue to move forward. I think we have so many opportunities that lie ahead in specific areas, predominantly with the Innovation District. I was fortunate in my time working in the mayor's office to really have a very close interaction with the making of this Innovation District plan. It went before the City Council in December of 2017, and it was approved unanimously. And now the city staff working at how do we continue to encourage in a specific given area. The Innovation District includes our downtown, part of our north side, and part of the east side. Encourage that innovation where we look at incubator spaces, where we look at high-tech innovative industries that will come to our area and employ our various graduates and individuals that specialize in specific fields. That's one way to truly grab hold of that slogan of the City of Arts and Innovation and use it moving forward. In terms of the arts component, though, I think our downtown is the prime location for the most vibrant arts and culture scene in Southern California. And we have so much potential, and it's going to take many partnerships with our various artistic institutions, our museums in downtown, to encourage that public art, to encourage in future developments that component.
What about the potential for tax on developers for public art?
I think we have to be very careful in that we want to develop our downtown. We want to encourage growth in our downtown. And if we begin with putting too many taxes or requirements on developers, that could be somewhat of a hindrance in that development. So I think it is important to encourage public art. I think there are better ways of doing it when we come up with partnerships with our various artistic nonprofit organizations and museums to encourage that versus really passing the buck and adding an additional layer of taxation to our various developers in town.
Mr. Gardner.
I agree that an arts tax is problematic. There are so many fees on development today that adding an additional fee will make development more difficult. An example is Riverside County has a transportation uniform mitigation fee. San Bernardino County does not have that. It's a significant expense to any development in our county, and we compete with San Bernardino County all the time. One thing we have done, and I think is appropriate, is for significant new developments, we are asking the developer to include public art as part of the development, and you see that as you move around the city. We want to be careful you don't focus it just in downtown.
Do they comply when you ask?
I'm sorry?
Do they comply when you ask? I mean, you can ask a lot, but do they say, okay, I'll include public art?
I'm not aware of one that has said no.
Okay.
And if you think about it, it actually benefits their project if there is something there that people want to look at.
I want to ask you specifically about a statue. I believe it's of two boxers. It looks like it's of two boxers at University and Market.
Yes.
And I know that you were the champion behind that statue, which some like, some not so much. But talk to us about that process. How did it inform your view of bringing public art to the city?
Well, that actually is a sculpture by a local Riverside artist. It was offered to the city at a really good price for that size sculpture. It is not two boxers, it is two very different people, and the title of the sculpture is Accept Difference, which I think is very important in our society and our city today. One of the reasons that I particularly liked that sculpture, it is sort of freeform, but it's in a very prominent spot in our downtown. We secured that for $18,000. It was actually initially commissioned for another city for almost six figures.
But they rejected it, I hear.
They didn't reject it. They moved their funding.
Okay.
It wasn't they didn't like the piece. They liked the piece. So I think it is an example. It is one that was city funded. Funding came out of our Arts and Culture Division to cover the cost of that.
I want to move on to another topic. Aaron Edwards had mentioned our universities. We're going to start with Philip, but I reference your reference to universities. What would you do as a council member to leverage the strength of our multiple local universities to help increase prosperity, opportunity, and the quality of life in Riverside? Of course, when I say university, I include where we are today, Riverside City College, universities and colleges. Yeah. So many great ones here in Riverside.
We are poised with an opportunity in Riverside, I think, that many cities are envious of. When you have really 4 universities and colleges, collectively in the city of Riverside, and really the amount of talent and intellectual capital that is fed out of, that comes out of these various institutions is something that I think is very unique and important for Riverside to be looking at. We have, for decades, if not longer, in Riverside, talked about this brain drain, this loss of that intellectual capital in those individuals upon completing of their education. And I think what is unique about myself is that we need to focus on engaging the next generation of Riversiders to plant roots here, to encourage them to stay here. And the way that we do that was something I had mentioned in my previous response, is that when you have something like the Innovation District or various industries that are really creating jobs of the 21st century, we must be focused on that as one way of keeping our various graduates here and young people here, is because of those jobs of the 21st century. And that is Innovation District and other things like that will create those jobs and spur that growth. That's one way to create some synergy between those institutions. We have the California Air Resources Board, of course, that is coming to Ward 2, but coming to Riverside nonetheless. And that, I think, will be a large engine for attracting other similarly minded organizations and institutions that then turn around and employ many people that specialize in those
What
fields.
about in Ward 1?
In Ward 1, we're faced with many opportunities, predominantly in the north side, where that, again, will in downtown encompass part of that innovation district. I think that we have many different areas where we can progress in, one of them being in medical. You know, we are severely underserved here in this city and region when it comes to medical services, along with when we look at these jobs of the 21st century, these futuristic industries, you know, rooted in sustainability, rooted in ensuring that we are living in a place that has clean air, water, forms of transportation, different things that we are poised with, and we have the ability in Ward 1 with our downtown, with our north side, to really act on some of those opportunities.
Mr. Gardner, please respond and talk to us about what has already happened in Ward 1 during the 12 years you've been on the council as it relates to responsive connections, collaborations between universities and colleges.
I can remember being a part of putting together the first meeting where representatives from UCR, Cal Baptist University, and La Sierra University appeared in the same room together. They didn't used to cooperate or collaborate at all. They used to compete, and now they are working much better together. I think I played a small role in having that happen. There are some important things that have happened in Ward 1 related to the universities and RCC. The UC Med School has 2 offices, clinic offices in our downtown. California Baptist University had a art exhibit or an art gallery on the Main Street Mall. UCR has the Culver Center and the Photography Museum. It's actually called the UCR Arts Block on the Main Street Mall between 9th Street and, between University and 9th Street. RCC is an amazing partner. They built a aquatic center, a world-class aquatic center in partnership with the city. We have a number.
We're going to proceed. Now the 90 seconds is up on this question. Aaron, please.
This is a very important topic to me personally, as the reason that my family came to Riverside was because of UCR and a job at UCR. And in my household, we talk all the time about how we can do an even better job of leveraging relationships between community and between university, and how to encourage students not only to study here, but to stay here in Riverside. And I have lived in many cities across the United States and have lived in university towns. And when I was part of the focus groups for the new economic development plan for the city, I sat at the table with representatives from our colleges and universities where we said, why doesn't Riverside feel like a university town? And so to me, it's looking at the numbers. We know that in 2018, UCR students alone generated $2 billion in the economy here in Riverside. That's just UCR. How can we make sure that students are doing or generating revenue uniformly across the city, and are not only excited to do it when they're students here, but then can see themselves, can actually see the neighborhood that they'll live in when they stay in Riverside, can see the job that they'll work in? How can we engage different businesses here in Riverside to work with students to do apprenticeship programs?
It's a very fair question. I want to expand on that, because how can we keep the UCR, La Sierra, Cal Baptist graduates here. We know when UCR Medical started, it was a requirement that half their class come from inland Southern California because of, you mentioned, the lack of doctors, and we do see that brain drain that Philip mentioned. So as someone who has lived in different cities, how do you convince the best of the best to remain in this crown jewel that is Riverside?
Some of it comes down to placemaking and doing an even better job of telling our story in Riverside. Asking the questions, do the professors who work at our colleges and universities, do they live here? If not, why? How can we together do a better job of talking about how wonderful Riverside is as a place to live? And if we can do a better job of telling that story and of investing in our neighborhoods and sharing the stories of innovations and ideas that students have and actually engaging them in those ideas and making our city a better place, that's how we succeed there.
I want to talk about an exciting development that will be joining Riverside, and that's the Cheech Marin Museum.
Yes.
A lot of hoopla surrounding that. That being said, let's dig deep into it. Do we know if city funds were used to lure the Cheech Marin Museum here? And if so, was that a good use of the money, of also the space where the Cheech Marin Museum will occupy? I think we're starting with Mr. Gardner.
Okay, let me, before I get into that, just real quickly
Please.
respond a bit to the UCR question. I think I'm the classic example of the person who came to Riverside to go to UCR and elected to stay here. That's what I did. My job was in Rosemead. I stayed in Riverside because Riverside is Riverside, and I wanted to be here and I wanted to help make it a better place. Speaking now to your question on the Cheech, very little city money went into the planning and design of the facility. It will remain a city-owned facility, and you know, that's the permanent plan, is it will always be a city-owned facility. The money has been raised privately and through some state funding. The city helped advocate for both the private funding and the state funding, but there really is very little city money in the project itself other than the property, and the property will be rented long-term.
Let me ask, do you want to respond to the Cheech Marin question? We're running tight on time, but if you want to respond, please.
I would just say that I am very excited about this project. It's one of the reasons that one of the many reasons that we're thrilled to stay as a family and to have purchased our first home downtown. So we'll be within walking distance of such a wonderful and rich cultural center. It is so important to me that as we think about telling the story of Riverside, as I talked about in my previous answer, that we're talking about telling all of our stories from all of the many communities that have made Riverside home.
I think that this is one of the prime examples of living up to that title of the City of Arts and Innovation. And I think so much of this the due honor must be shown to the Riverside Art Museum and people, community champions like Ophelia Valdez-Yeager, who really together comprehensively have made this become a reality. This is absolutely going to be something so unique to Riverside that it will spur tourism that generates additional sales tax and revenue for our city. So it's something that we're so excited to see.
Speaking of sales tax, let's talk about Measure Z. How well has the city done keeping its commitments to voters about how to spend tens of millions of dollars in annual tax receipts from Measure Z? If you believe that the proceeds should be spent differently, how? We're going to start with Aaron Edwards.
Measure Z has been an incredible gift to the city of Riverside, and I believe that we have put many good processes in place as a city to see that this money is stewarded and to be transparent with the way that the money is used. And just recently, I was at the fire station as we unveiled 17 new pieces of equipment, and that was so wonderful to see. We can see our dollars in action. We can see that we have the latest equipment as we know that we're facing potentially more and more fires into the future. Commissioner, I am proud of the fact that as a taxpayer, my money is going to support the Office of Homeless Solutions. I am proud that we'll be building a new library downtown that will be a hub of innovation and that will serve families like mine in story time. So to answer your question, I think we are doing a good job of stewarding those dollars. For me now, the question is, how do we ensure that this process remains transparent? How do we continue to talk well about how the money is being spent so we can look at the future of Measure Z?
What about parks, though? I know you're a mother, I believe you're a mother, so it doesn't seem as if we see Measure Z money flowing to city parks. What's your sense on that?
I would love to see more investment in parks. I am a mother. I'm the mother of a toddler. Parks are very important to us, not just the many beautiful parks we have, but I'd love to see how we can make even better use of green space in our city, what I've been calling pocket parks throughout downtown and in many neighborhoods across the city. Is this the place to be using Measure Z funding? That is part of a larger conversation. Or can we do what I have been successful at doing in the past, which is taking funding that we have and leveraging it to get additional funding from other sources that can help support our parks?
Philip.
I think an important component of this is exactly why we created the Budget Engagement Commission. And I would hope that moving forward, that the larger council, I know I'm willing to pledge to do this on the city council, but the larger council as well, that they truly look to and take the advice of the various members of the Budget Engagement Commission, that when it comes to the allocation, future allocation, and various initiatives from the Measure Z money, I think as a city commissioner, I uniquely have the perspective that in many cases you are faced with a current city council that you seek to advise as a city commissioner. However, they in many cases have come in already with their mind made up, and I think that is a unique point from the Budget Engagement Commission that we have to be looping in with that. But I also bring this back to exactly what Measure Z was initially dubbed as, or was sold as, and that was investment in infrastructure, investment in our police department, the critical quality of life needs. And
But not investment in parks.
Not investment in parks when it was originally went out into the public, and I think that is, parks are vital quality of life services, so I would see that would be, one place where maybe that goes to the Budget Engagement Commission, and we flesh out that discussion, because parks do fall under the umbrella of quality of life. So there is that component, but many times when I speak to various neighbors throughout the ward, they look to Measure Z, they want more road repaving, they want more police officers for when they have a call for service, they can rely on someone getting to them in a reasonable amount of time, and that I think is an important component.
Mr. Gardner, let me ask you, as you consider this question, why were parks left out of Measure Z? I believe you were on the council when Measure Z was drafted.
I was. I think the passage of Measure Z as a general tax, which leaves how the dollars are spent up to the discretion of the council. A specific tax would dictate how dollars got spent. I think that shows the faith and trust that our population at large has in our council. And I think that's an important statement in itself. I think our spending priorities were off in the early years of Measure Z. I argued that as we were allocating dollars. I wanted more dollars to go to services that people see every day. A majority of the council wanted to spend more of those dollars on internal financial housekeeping things, which, while important, I would have waited a bit on. Parks just fell out of the equation. I think that was a mistake. I argued against it. Same with tree trimming, street maintenance, those kinds of things. We built our general fund reserves to up over 23%. We don't need to be that high. It's nice to have the money, but I think it would have been nicer to have the services.
Mr. Gardner, I want to start with you on this. We'll, of course, return to our other candidates. You have been the Ward 1 City Council member since 2007.
Yes.
Why specifically should voters retain you on the council And then when I'll turn to the challengers, what are reasons you believe that you should be selected over the incumbent? And I want you to give us 2 specific reasons. But we're going to start with Mr. Gardner on this direct question.
The others are welcome to talk about why I should stay on the council.
Of course they are.
I think there are 2 important things. One that I would ask voters is evaluate the job that I have done for you in the past 12 years. Do I need to be replaced? If I've done a poor job, you should select someone else. If I've done a good job, let me continue to do that for you. Particularly now with elections in 4 wards and 3 of the incumbents not standing for re-election. We are going to have 3 brand new council members. I believe that my experience and knowledge and proven leadership is particularly important at this time, particularly as we go into having to deal with the challenge of the pension liability and allocating appropriately Measure Z dollars.
At the same time, you have pursued other offices since 2007. You've pursued the mayor's office, the supervisor's office. And so the question becomes, why do you believe voters should believe that you are committed to this position in that you've sought different offices during your tenure over the last 12 years?
I think my record shows that I am committed. I almost never miss a council meeting, and it's only because I am out of town doing something on behalf of the city if I do miss a meeting. Yes, I did seek 2 other offices. I do not intend to seek any other offices. I have no interest in partisan political office. I would not accept an appointment to the U.S. Senate. I am committed to the city of Riverside. I've never sought an office that didn't directly serve the city of Riverside, and I remain committed.
I want to continue, if I may, since you're the incumbent in this race, and ask you, and we'll get to you, I promise, on the question of replacement. I want to talk about the warehouse issue. Warehouses are quite controversial, and as you know, the warehouse on the north side of Ward 1 was ultimately passed by a 5-2 vote. You were in the 2. And so the question becomes, yes, there's the Brown Act, and you can only work to persuade your council members so much, but you have to do that from the dais. And so talk to us about that, what some would argue would be a tricky defeat on an issue that was within your very ward.
I was very disappointed in 5 of my fellow council members on that vote. I think my arguments were on point and accurate. I continue to believe that while that project is consistent with zoning, it is not consistent with the general plan.
So what can be done to fix that? What have you done? What will you do?
The specific project has been challenged in court, and I believe the argument that it is not consistent with the general plan will prevail. I do not believe that project will be built. In terms of what we are doing to keep that from happening, 2 things. One is we are in the middle of the Northside specific plan process, which will lay out a vision for the majority of the Northside neighborhood, including that site, and the zoning to go with it. And we are also citywide updating our general plan and making the zoning consistent with the general plan for those areas where we don't have specific plans. And I think that's one of the reasons that we had the problem with the warehouse on the north side, was it was consistent with zoning, and the other council members put more weight on that than on the general plan.
I want to turn to Aaron on the opening initial question, and specifically for you as a challenger. I'll read it to you again. What are 2 specific reasons voters should choose you over the sitting incumbent?
As I mentioned in the beginning of the forum this morning, my background over a decade is addressing complex issues like homelessness for a United Way, for a network of soup kitchens, food pantries, homeless shelters, for an organization that serves youth in the foster care system. homelessness is the biggest issue that we are facing now as a city, and we must have someone on city council who
Is it
has.
though the biggest? Is it the biggest issue?
I believe it is the biggest issue, and I believe that, well, of course, there are many issues facing our city, but I know that homelessness is such a big issue because when I go to door to door and when I walk our ward from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top, and I ask residents, what is the biggest issue you see in Riverside, or what would you like to see in your city? Everyone talks to me about homelessness.
Okay, so first is your experience. What's the second reason?
The second reason is that I believe that Riverside can be a city where everyone can thrive, but only if we are a city where everyone is represented, and particularly in government. And if we look, the statistics alone, within a 3-mile radius of downtown, the average age is 29 years old. We're seeing changing demographics in Ward 1 of families that look like mine. When the food lab opened, which is very close to my house, we can walk there.
And very tasty.
And very tasty. One of the things that Food Lab needed to order more of in the first weekend is high chairs, because they hadn't anticipated that there would be so many young families out and excited to enjoy the downtown. So we need council members that represent the changing demographics of our city.
Before I ask you to answer the question, Philip, do you believe homelessness is the biggest issue facing the city council today?
I think there's not one sole number one issue that we're facing with. There are so many that have significance that are somewhat apples to oranges. So I wouldn't say it's the number one above absolutely everything else.
Mr. Gardner, do you believe homelessness is the biggest issue?
I think it is the biggest issue in the eyes of the residents of the city. From the council perspective, I think our financial issues rise above that.
Okay, back to you, Philip. I apologize.
The
Two
question being
reasons.
two reasons,
Two
yes.
reasons why you should replace the incumbent, if at all.
I think one thing that is critical in terms of any elected representative is having the ability to be decisive. I think our current leadership has shown in many cases somewhat of a waffling mentality. A prime example is the most recent city manager debacle that went down when it came with the contract for the city council, and then 6 weeks later switching a vote. That lack of decisiveness, I think, really cost the citizens of Riverside a significant amount of money, as well as heartache and headache that was unnecessary. So I think having a decisive demeanor, of course listening to the various stakeholders in the community, in those that specialize in specific realms, that's critical. But at the end of the day, the city council person has to be able to make a decision and stand by it, knowing that not everyone will always agree with your decision, but knowing that you are the elected leader to do so. So having a decisive demeanor is critical and important. Secondly, I don't subscribe to the school of thought that having 4 new council members is just too much of a weight to bear for our city. I think that is absolutely a fear tactic. I think that telling the community that 3 is okay, but 4 is just too much to bear is somewhat of a misnomer. I think that government thrives on change. I believe in term limits. I also think that it is important for individuals that serve to know that when government has shifts, when government has changes, we come to a better end result and a better end decision when there's diverse viewpoints at the table.
Before we conclude, I
Yes.
want Mr. Gardner to address the very issue of the switch in the city manager vote. You supported his retention, and then 6 weeks later you opposed his retention.
That becomes difficult to talk about because it's a personnel issue and there are things I cannot talk about.
Okay.
But I did support the extension of the city manager's contract. I always was impressed by our former city manager. He had some really great ideas. We wouldn't have the Cheech without him, as an example. He also did some things that I really did not like, which I cannot talk about, and that caused the change in my position. He was not dismissed for cause. He was a at-will employee, but I had specific reasons, things he had done that I just could not live with.
Okay. Our final question, which is acting as if it's a closing statement. By many measures, Riverside is a good place to live. What specifically would you do to help Riverside make the leap from good to great? Are warehouse and construction jobs enough to push the area to the next level? Or does the city need something more. Give us kind of a big picture look at how we make Riverside a great place. We'll start with Mr. Gardner and then go backwards.
I think there are three primary areas that make Riverside what Riverside is. One is we are, in fact, a college town. 3 large universities and Riverside Community College. We have more than 50,000 students who live in our city, and that brings a whole set of vibrancy and interests and skills that other cities just don't have. Another is our neighborhoods, and I don't feel like we are paying enough attention to our neighborhoods today in terms of things like the Measure Z spending. I think we should have invested more dollars there earlier. And third is our vision and our excitement as a city, the economic development that we have achieved and that we have coming. We have to focus on more solid jobs, whether it's in manufacturing or in banking, finance, medicine, white-collar jobs. We need them both, and that's what will help keep people here. It will generate the funds that will make the city able to pay its bills and do a better job.
Thank you, sir. Philip Falcone.
I think to start with, it has to be the long-term vision. When we look at Riverside moving into the future, how do we aspire to be in the next 20, 25 years and moving forward? I think that is broken down then into a couple different realms. One of it being the economic development component, jobs of the 21st century, jobs that are reliable, that cannot be replaced by automation in the near future. That does not mean warehousing. That does not mean jobs that fall in that specific vein. We have to encourage economic development that is sustainable for the long term. Also infrastructure. Infrastructure is something I'm very passionate about in terms of ensuring that from the very critical responsibilities of government, your infrastructure of a town is very important to maintain moving forward, because that ensures that we have reliable and expedient services, as well as roads and sidewalks and tree trimming and things that are critical to any service of a city. That helps to progress and move us forward. And finally, I think the importance of public engagement in the political process. That as a whole will take Riverside to the next level, because we will have engaged citizens, engaged residents that are aware of what's going on in our city and are active and are invested in that. And that will move us forward into the future.
Aaron Edwards.
When I think about taking Riverside from good to great, as you said, if I have to pick only 3, I would start here. We need to, as I've spoken about before, create good, well-paying jobs here so that people who live in Riverside can live and work in the same place. That is a quality of life issue. And not only is it a quality of life issue, but it's imperative if we want to see people who can afford housing here in Riverside, for example. The second piece I'd like to see to take us from good to great is focusing on walkability as a city and how to really be a green city, particularly in a time when some people describe Riverside as the loading dock of the West Coast, and that makes me very sad to hear. I want to make sure that we're focused on improving our air quality and making sure that people in their neighborhoods not only feel secure and connected where they live, but they have amenities that they can walk to get out and meet their neighbors and feel invested in a place. And third, as we've spoken about today, Riverside has so many amazing assets, the Cheech being just one, the new library, the Harada House. I could go on and on. Now our big challenge will be, how do we connect these assets to each other to help us tell our story, to draw tourists here, not just from outside Riverside, but from other wards.
I want to thank Aaron Edwards, Philip Falcone, and Mike Gardner, candidates for Riverside City Council Ward 1, for joining us on behalf of the Raincross Group, the PIC Group, Riverside City College, the Riverside Press Enterprise, and Spectrum. We thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brad Pomerantz.